Welcome back, everyone. Welcome again to the 13th Annual Augustine Collective Conference, AC 2021. For our AC students who had their conference groups before this session, we hope you had a fun and fruitful time. We're so excited now to welcome you back to the first plenary session of the weekend and our first official speaker to help us think through the contributions that Christianity can make to the university. As a reminder, please do continue to share quotes, pictures, thoughts on your preferred social media platforms and tag both the Veritas Forum and the Agustine Collective. Let me also welcome back the students here as part of the forum's leadership cohort and our AC alumni. And a special welcome as well to our Veritas financial partners and friends who are joining us today. We're so glad that you have taken the time out of your busy schedules to join over 250 student writers, designers, leaders, and event gurus who are seeking to give voice to thoughtful Christian perspectives on over 30 campuses across the country. As the director of the Agustine Collective, I welcome you to this event and hope you enjoy your time here. We also want to say thank you. Your support makes Veritas and the AC conference possible. Now to our speaker and this session. We couldn't think of anyone better to lead off this weekend together and help us build vision for our work than professor, editor, and writer James K. Smith. I think Jamie is truly someone who needs no introduction for our network, but we've placed his bio in chat. I won't read the whole thing because you can find it there and in our program, but as many of you know, Jamie is an extremely interesting and thoughtful Christian scholar who has written on everything from postmodernism to cultural liturgies to his latest book on our namesake of the Augustine Collective, St. Augustine. Tonight, Jamie will be speaking on Christian faith as an intellectual offering to the university, lessons from St. Augustine. As a reminder, if you would like to ask Jamie a question for this session and you're part of the forums or AC cohorts or the alumni, please ask the question in CVent. If you're unsure how to ask a question in CVent, please see the event guide or reach out to the AC staff. With that, we'd like to welcome Jamie Smith. Thanks so much, Jamie, and please take it away.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be with you. It's by the way, it's very cool to see you in this role. I feel like I knew you back when, and it's a treat to see your leadership here. Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be with you. I honestly don't say this to everybody. I love the Augustine Collective. I brag about you guys all over the world and tell all kinds of people that in a way the Augustine Collective is kind of one of the things that really gives me hope about the future of faith and the future for a robust Christian intellectual witness here in the United States and in the world. So it's really always a treat for me to be part of. I wish we were all hanging out together and could chat afterwards, but I want to say too, I want to just encourage you. I guess I also want to kind of bless you and say, listen, I know how hard it is just to learn in a pandemic. University has been hard for the past year, and I know how taxing it is for you guys to just study and learn and try to have a university experience that you've hoped for in the midst of this, and that you are also answering this call to be part of God's mission in the world, I think is just remarkable. And so I hope you'll be so energized by this weekend. I hope that you'll be blessed by it. I hope you'll be energized. I hope you'll catch a vision. But I also hope it will be restorative for you in important ways. The work that you are doing is, I think, a kind of dance, because to bear intellectual witness to the Christian faith in the contemporary university is, we have to say, to be regularly challenged about the very plausibility of faith. So it's very natural in that situation to become maybe focused on defending the faith, that is trying to clear space for the rationality and plausibility for Christianity in our somewhat intolerant marketplace of ideas. That's understandable. It's important. What I would like to talk to you about tonight is just complicating that endeavor a little bit. You've probably heard that oft-cited C.S. Lewis quote, which is that I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because I see everything by it. Well, let me riff on that and say, sometimes I think we can end up trying to prove the existence of the sun rather than letting the sun illuminate the world that we share with our neighbors. So tonight, really, what I want to encourage you to do is to champion Christian faith as a light that illumines. Because by doing so, you'll show your peers how the very strangeness of Christianity actually offers what I'll call intellectual wells that run deeper than many of the alternatives that are on offer. So, our task is not just establishing and defending the truth of Christianity, but what I want to also talk about tonight is offering the truth of Christianity as a gift to the world, like lighting a lamp in the dark. So instead of always or only or just arguing for the distinctiveness of Christian belief, I want to suggest we can offer the distinctiveness of revelation to illumine our common humanity. If we lean into what we share as fellow humans and inhabitants of this planet, we will bolster the intellectual status of Christian faith because we'll actually be showing Christianity's capacity to better answer some of our most opaque but shared existential questions. So sometimes that means helping our fellow humans to name the mysteries, whether that's the dark mystery of evil or the deep secrets of human consciousness and the will, or this still enduring longing for transcendence that keeps finding sometimes unsettling outlets in our world. And so this is why I want to bring you back to St. Augustine, that great doctor of the church. For those who might not be familiar, Augustine lives in the late 300s and early 400s in North Africa. And to me, your work is so aptly named because Augustine embodies exactly what we're going to be talking about tonight. I want to suggest that Augustine is familiar with this dance, this tightrope of, on the one hand, grappling with the plausibility of Christianity, but also confident that Christianity illumines the world better than any other worldview on offer. And so it's something that he wants to share, that he wants others to see the world through. So I want to spend a little time on a bit of Augustine's intellectual itinerary to see how this worked out in his own life. And that itinerary is long and circuitous. I'm just going to focus on a couple of phases of that. And the first is I'd like to consider a phase of his pre-Christian life, actually, that then really shaped what his intellectual witness looked like later. You see, for a long time in his 20s, Augustine had joined this sect, this crew, this kind of mix of philosophical and spiritual community called the Manichaeans. And this detour in Augustine's journey, on the one hand, kind of will seem hopelessly irrelevant to 21st century seekers if you really just consider what the Manichaeans, these devotees of Mani, believed. The teachings of Mani are crazy. They are weird. They are foreign and fantastical, and they don't really have any contemporary analog. What one biographer has said that Mani's cosmology is a lot more like Star Wars than anything that's really on offer today. So I'm not saying that what he argued with the Manichees is directly relevant. What I'm interested in, I want us to look past the details and content of the Manichaeans' doctrine and actually see what drew the young Augustine in was the way they claimed to know. See, what's instructive about Augustine's attraction to Manichaeism is less what they taught and more how they held to that teaching. So in this respect, we'll notice that there's something sort of shockingly contemporary about the Manichaeans' epistemic posture, we would say. That is, the way they claim to know things. And the irony, perhaps, because they believe such weird things, the irony is they were actually the rationalists of their day. That is, while their worldview seems really fantastical, the Manichaeans actually kind of prided themselves on having escaped superstition and the embarrassments of believing, and instead claimed to have arrived at the sort of the shore of enlightened knowledge. In fact, it's not a stretch really to say the Manichaeans were kind of they considered themselves the scientists of significance, of meaning, that instead of trusting the testimony of prophets or revelation, their knowledge, they thought, was rooted in the course of the sun, moon, and stars. So they took themselves to be the purveyors of light because they were the one who offered secret enlightenment. They prided themselves on refusing believing, refusing authority, refusing revelation, and just knowing how things worked. Now, so the young Augustine's attraction to Manichaeism was kind of about association with people who confidently offered a posture as much as a doctrine. He writes later in his life, he writes to an old friend of his, Honoratus, who was actually part of the Manichaean crew at the time. And he says, "We fell in with them, Honoratus, because they promised a way to rise above those held in fear by superstition." And he says, who would not be enticed by promises like that? And I want us to recognize this is a dynamic that is not so different from some streams of the contemporary university. It's sort of a familiar recipe for recruitment, you could say. It's trotted out by rationalist purveyors of scientism who are promising to unlock all the mysteries of the universe by a science that supposedly shows there are no mysteries, there are only puzzles. So whether it's the Richard Dawkins or Steven Pinkers, these priests of enlightenment are almost always prophets of overreach. That is, they're promising a status often more than they promise an adequate explanation. And if we have a tendency to buy into that, if our peers have tendencies to buy into that, honestly, it's less because the system works intellectually, and often more because it comes with this allure of illumination, of sophistication, and it also comes with the added benefit of throwing off the naivete of our parents' simplistic faith, perhaps. In this sense, their claims to enlightenment, their claims to knowledge are sort of like shortcuts to respectability. Augustine lived that. Augustine did that. Augustine got sucked in by that. Here's the thing about the way those sorts of circles work, though. You're not supposed to ask too many questions once you make it inside the circle. And that was Augustine's problem. He actually ultimately wasn't satisfied just with association. He actually wanted to understand. And when he kept pressing the Manichaeans with questions, interestingly, what they kept telling him was, well, wait till Faustus comes. Faustus was sort of the great teacher amongst the Manichaeans at the time. So wait till Faustus comes. He'll explain everything. And so Augustine gets his audience with Faustus. He's like, okay, finally, somebody's going to answer all the questions. Except he didn't. And the disenchantment that Augustine experienced afterwards was actually really wrenching for him because he saw through this. Now, why is this relevant for us? What's intriguing is that once Augustine saw through this, and then later, as a Christian reflecting on this, what he did is intellectually, polemically, you could almost say, he kind of pulled the rug out from under their stance of so-called rational self-sufficiency. And he says, look, everyone believes. Everyone submits to some authority. All these people who are priding themselves on enlightenment have actually really just traded belief in one set of authorities for another. Credulity, believing, Augustine says, is not a defect. It's actually inherent to being human. Trust is the oxygen of human society, he says, and believing the testimonies of others is actually at the very heart of the scientific enterprise. So understanding, knowledge, enlightenment doesn't transcend belief. It doesn't overcome belief. It actually relies on belief. And Augustine says, look, anybody who joins the Manichees at some point does it because they believed a Manichee, what a Manichee told them. You can't, nobody escapes trust. Nobody escapes faith. Now, when Augustine becomes a Christian, he doesn't promise some other self-sufficient enlightenment to counter what the Manichees were offering. He's calling into question the very myth of that kind of enlightened, self-sufficient stance. See, the question isn't whether you're going to believe. The question is who. It's not merely about what to believe. It's really a question of who to entrust yourself to. Augustine says to the Manichaeans, the people who are so confident in their own ingenuity and enlightenment, he says, do you really want to trust yourself? And this feels like a very, very relevant contemporary question. Do we really think humanity is our best bet? Do we really think we are the answer to our problems when we're actually the ones who have also generated them? The problem with everything from sort of like enlightenment scientism to mushy eat, pray, loveism, the problem with all of it is us. Sometimes, if anything looks irrational, it's the notion that we are our own best hope. And yet so many of the orthodoxies of the academy are some version of confidence in human ingenuity. But Augustine says, look, at the heart of Christianity is not even just a teaching, he emphasizes. At the heart of Christianity is an event. It's an unthinkable event from that Manichaean perspective, from that Enlightenment self-sufficiency perspective. It's an event that is unthinkable, and yet it's one that speaks to humanity's deepest hungers and fears. Augustine puts it this way at one point in the letter. Could God have done anything kinder or more generous than for the real, eternal, unchanging wisdom of God himself, to which we must cling, to condescend to take on human form? By his miraculous birth and his deeds, he won our love. By his death and resurrection, he drove out fear. See, Augustine says, look, you're going to entrust yourself to somebody. Wouldn't you rather entrust yourself to the one who gave himself for you? So Augustine kind of sees through this claim to enlightenment, but that doesn't immediately turn into conversion to the Christian faith for him. There's actually, after this sort of really reeling experience of leaving the Manichees, he really dwells in a skepticism for a long time. He struggles a lot. And what changes everything is he meets someone. Sometimes plausibility is pegged to a person. And the turning point for Augustine, in some ways, was not an argument. It was Ambrose. It was the Bishop of Milan. It was someone he met. And what Ambrose said, what he taught and preached, that was not insignificant. That was important. But really what made a dent on Augustine's imagination was Ambrose's very being. That is, it's like Ambrose embodied and represented a way of life and showed Augustine a way to put things together that he had never seen before. Ambrose was like a living icon of somebody who had integrated assiduous learning and rigorous academic reflection with ardent Christian faith. And Augustine had never imagined that that was possible. Based on his childhood experience to that point, Augustine, sort of snobbily actually, had concluded that Christians were always simple and backward and naive. But this encounter with Ambrose sort of destabilized all of that for him. And it really prompted him to reconsider his dismissal of the Christian faith. So what was it that ultimately shifted the plausibility structures, the believability of the Christian faith for Augustine? Look, I don't want to sound mushy, but it was love. His recollection is so warm. And when he remembers Ambrose, he's speaking about a hunger that's even more fundamental than the intellectual. In his confessions, he says this about Ambrose: "That man of God took me up as a father takes a newborn baby in his arms. And in the best tradition of bishops, he prized me as a foreign sojourner." There's this deep sense, and I guess I just want to remind you of that in the work that you're doing, is that sometimes we won't even appreciate the mysteries by which God is using our personhood, our exemplarity, our being, our relationships to model for somebody the plausibility of the Christian faith. We can model and show what it looks like to put these things together. It's not when Augustine heard Ambrose, met Ambrose, got to talk to Ambrose, it's not like all of a sudden the light went on and he figured out Christianity is true, but it made it possible for him to entertain it again in ways he never had before. What ultimately Augustine has to work through are some really deep, existential, haunting questions that he hasn't been able to answer yet. And this is where I want to make the pivot to the theme I want to leave you with, which is what Augustine found in Christianity was not just something that he could believe, but something that he needed to believe, because only Christianity helped pull together his world, helped him to make sense of his world as none of the other intellectual offerings around him could do. The intellectual breakthrough comes for him, if you go back to the Confessions, you see this happens when he discovers Platonism, and that's kind of his, I was going to say gateway drug, but that seems an inappropriate metaphor. It's his preamble to faith. The tools of Platonic philosophy were a kind of intellectual gymnasium for Augustine, where he could sort of work to increase the range of motion in his conceptual muscles. It was like philosophy helped him to start to be able to think things that he hadn't been able to think before because of the limited intellectual toolkit that he had received from the Manichaeans and others. And so he was starting to realize, oh, maybe I don't have to choose between faith and reason. Philosophy was starting to look like this preamble to Christianity. And then eventually he also realizes that there are limits even to what Platonism can answer. And he realized that only Christianity, only a philosophy rooted in that event of a God who descended and died and rose from the dead, only that could really grapple with the challenge of evil. Augustine, I think, like so many of us, was sort of haunted and stalked by the problem of evil. And what he found in Christianity was the only way that he could make sense of it. His philosophical wrestling didn't just give him permission to believe Christianity, it left him convinced that the incarnational logic of the Christian faith actually had a theoretical power to help people understand the broken world in which they found themselves. It's not, friends, that just that Christianity deserves a seat at the academic table, even if that's true. What I want us to entertain is that the Christian faith could set the table with a feast that might finally satisfy the intellectual hungers of those who are seated at that table. So it's in that spirit that I want to suggest that your work with your journals, with the mission and ministry that you are carrying out in the midst of the university, your work is not only to argue for the truth of Christianity, but to offer the truths of a Christian vision as an intellectual gift to the academic community. I'm not saying they're looking for it. I'm not saying they're coming, saying, please give us this. I'm saying they might not know that that's what they've been wanting. They might not know that that's what they've been looking for. And that we as Christians in the academy can confidently but humbly articulate the riches of a Christian understanding of the cosmos, of human nature, and really offer this as a theoretical framework that actually generates a better account of the phenomena, that actually does a better job of doing what the university is trying to do, which is to understand the world and understand ourselves. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to interview one of my real heroes, Nicholas Wolterstorff, who's a Christian philosopher who taught for a long time at Yale University. And Wolterstorff is such an inspiration because he's an unapologetic Christian philosopher who also was widely respected in the discipline as a whole. And he's particularly written some influential books on justice. And I asked him in this interview about his posture as a Christian philosopher in the mainstream academy. And he told me this that I've never ever forgotten. Here's what he said. I was not trained to think of my role as a Christian philosopher as mainly that of a combatant, right? So he says, I wasn't trained as a Christian philosopher to think that my role was mainly that of a combatant. He says, no, philosophy is a human enterprise. It's not a Christian enterprise. It's not a humanist enterprise. It's not a naturalist enterprise. It's a human enterprise. And we participate together in this enterprise insofar as that is possible, talking with each other, discussing issues together, sometimes agreeing, sometimes disagreeing, and taking it from there. He said, I think it was this sense of being a participant in this shared enterprise, rather than a combatant against the enterprise, that was crucial. Friends, I think this is so important for the work that you are doing. You too, as participants in the university's life, are participants in a shared enterprise. Your journals are contributions to a human enterprise. And here's what should nourish your boldness in offering Christianity as a lens for your neighbors. The good news of the gospel is that in Christ, by grace, we are finally invited to be the humans God made us to be. The renewal of creation is the realization of what creation was made to be. The advent of shalom is the dawning of justice and flourishing that was always God's intention for the cosmos. Everything that Christianity hopes and proclaims and promises, I think, speaks to the yearnings of the human heart and the groanings of the earth. So let your journals be a light. Give your neighbors the lamp and invite them to see the sun because it illumines their world anew. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for that amazing, inspiring talk. Just a quick note before we do Q&A. I know some students may have had tech issues a bit during the session, but we did record it, so no worries. If you missed any of it, you can see the recording later, but I think they're able to catch it at the end there, so that's great. Couple of questions that have come through for you here. So on Augustine,
yeah.
Did Augustine incorporate his Neoplatonism into Christianity? Did he end up believing a Platonist version of Christianity, or did he just use Platonist language to express Christian truths? I think this is really relevant for thinking about frameworks that are out there and how do you incorporate them.
Yes, exactly. I think Augustine is a great model of critical appropriation. So on the one hand, as a participant in, let's just call it the intellectual life of his time, right? There's not quite a university, but as a participant in the intellectual life of his time, he finds tools nearby and discerns that the toolkit of Platonism is something he can get a lot of work done with to make sense of the Christian faith, but also to help the Christian faith make sense of the world. But then what also happens is there's a little bit of learning curve across Augustine's life, but what you also start to see is he realizes the pinch points and he says, well, as a Christian, I confess the resurrection of the body, which means I can't possibly agree that the body is a prison for the soul, right? So he pushes back on those aspects of Platonism. And I think it's a great model. You know, I'm a continental philosopher. I do French and German philosophy, and a teacher at Fordham University for years, Meryl Westphal, I always thought was a great model of somebody who knew how to discern. It's a work of discernment. What can I pick up from Michel Foucault? What can I pick up from Jacques Derrida? What can I deploy from Jean-Francois Lyotard? But then where are the pinch points where I have to say no? And Christian faith requires more creative thinking. I think we're always all doing that dance in the academy.
Yeah, that's actually a great segue, because someone else asked you about a decade after your Who's Afraid of Postmodernism, how do you still think about the value of those thinkers, and what are some insights you might take from them today?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a little bit because I feel like, apologies if I'm stepping on any toes here, but I feel like from what I've gathered, some of the rather anti-intellectual responses, for example, to critical race theory or discussions of bias and injustice, to me just seems so flat-footed in their wholesale dismissal of any theorizing that's not like quotes from the Bible. And I remain committed that in some sense, John Calvin liked to say, God speaks to us through a common grace so that we can discover truths in all kinds of places that aren't sanctified. And I still find myself returning to the insights of a Foucault or a Derrida or others. But again, you need to stay centered and grounded in the sort of heart of Christian faith to be able to do the careful work of discernment.
It's really helpful. Another question that we had come through: do you think that it's worthwhile for us to spend time becoming familiar with intellectual proofs of God, such as the fine-tuning argument, in order to make Christ more accessible to those in intellectual spaces who don't believe in God?
So I'm gonna, and this would be a much longer conversation. So it's a very good question, and it's a very fair question, and my short answer is not going to do justice to it. But let me say this. I come from a philosophical tradition that is generally skeptical about demonstrations and proofs for the existence of God, not because of philosophical commitments, but because of theological commitments. That is, what we call the noetic effects of sin seem to make us less confident that such arguments work. Almost sociologically, I would say this: I feel like most arguments for the existence of God do more work helping people who already believe feel confirmed and that they are rational in believing, which is a fine exercise. It's a very, very fine exercise. It's exactly why Anselm wrote the Proslogion. You have to remember, Aquinas's 5 ways are embedded in a Summa Theologica that are instructions in theology. So I think there's a place for those kinds of demonstrations. I just don't have very much confidence in their persuasive power for people who aren't already inclined to believe. And I think the persuasion is going to happen on a different register when we're talking across the divide of belief, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
An inadequate answer, to be sure.
Yeah, you could certainly do a whole seminar on that for sure. Yeah. Shifting gears a bit, someone kind of asked more on the practical side, tips for anyone interested in writing for image, but also more generally for writing about Christianity to the public. So just how do you think about being a Christian writer in a public space, potentially having secular readers, some ways that Christians can engage well in that space?
Yeah, I've been thinking more and more about this. What I would say is, let many flowers bloom. There are many, many different approaches to that, right? So Some people are writers for a public audience that are on the more, let's call it the more didactic end of the continuum. That is, they are writing to argue, they are writing to demonstrate, they are writing to make a point. It's sort of the, let's call it the op-ed end of the continuum, right? Where you're trying to make a case, you're trying to, it's didactic. That's fine. What I find myself drawn to more and more is what we might call the poetic end of the continuum, which is a kind of writing about Christian faith that tries to help people feel like what it might mean to believe. And this is where, this is where I put Marilyn Robinson. This is where I put Christian Wyman. This is a kind of writing about faith that I think has an imaginativity about it that meets people on a more affective register. And I think we need both kinds of writing. But I think I want to spend the next 15 years of my life on the poetic end of the continuum. And I really, really encourage young people today to consider that and to look at those models and not just, the Al Plantingas of the world, who, by the way, I'm a philosopher because of Al Plantinga. That's no knock on Saint Al. It's just saying there's different ways, and let's encourage multiple approaches.
Yeah, it's great. We actually have, as you know, we have both Marilyn and Christian Wyman here this weekend with the students.
Yeah,
so really
fantastic. No, it's great.
Yeah, just if I can interject a question, sort of as moderator. I know one thing we sometimes hear from students is there definitely was a period of time, in American culture when you had sort of the new atheists and the kind of objective or sort of active hostility towards religion, in which it felt like there was an interest there potentially, but it needed to be confronted with argument. I think today a lot of students say there's kind of an apathy more maybe than there had been even at that point. How do you think about a Christian task of addressing sort of apathetic audiences who may be secular, but may not see the need to even engage in sort of some of the questions that would be entry points for Christian dialogue?
Yeah, I think that's a fair analysis, right? And yeah, I'm not sure I have a formula for getting people to care, except that I think I keep looking for the touch points. Now I'm sort of talking Francis Schaeffer language, but I'm looking for the points of contact where people actually do manifest a kind of spiritual longing or hunger in ways that they might not have recognized for themselves. Like, so this is going to sound crazy, but this is just an example off the top of my head. The Peloton exercise community is absolutely a religious community. Do you know what I mean? Like and I don't think anybody there imagines that, but there's a strange way in which it's manifesting this hunger. I think there are university spaces where I spend a lot of time kind of the literary community side of the academy now. It is fascinating to me how on the other side of apathy might actually be a kind of openness. And so I don't have a great formulaic answer to the question, except that I think there's something about dwelling with people almost in the midst of their apathy until you bump up against the friction point where actually it turns out they're not as apathetic as you might think. I don't know. That's not a great answer.
No, that's really helpful. Great. Well, I see another question here. How do you break down a field or interest and relate it back to the common human experience, i.e. how can I connect architecture to human morality? So I think kind of more broadly, how do you think about as Christians engaging maybe non-Christian sort of disciplines, and how do you do that well?
And this is, I want to say, this is where we do this best in disciplinary spaces. So the thing that I don't want to do is presume to speak about these strategies from some sort of meta perspective, because I don't know that we can do that. Like, I'm thinking of the sociologist Christian Smith at Notre Dame, I think, is an example of someone who over the past 10, 15 years has undertaken a theoretical project, a methodological project, where he has tried to show that actually the sort of standard orthodoxies in the social sciences and the assumptions they make about human persons are inadequate to explain human behavior, precisely because they fail to assume that human beings are religious, right? There's sort of the theoretical framework is secular. But the way he does that is by showing that a more expansive theoretical framework that actually honors the religiosity of the human animal does better social science. And so I think everybody in their disciplines has to look for those points of contact, or Nick Wolterstorff likes to say, you need to be in your discipline and you look for the little cracks where you can place your pry bar and start to open up possibilities and show what the Christian faith has to bring. I think it's very different. Like, for example, I would love to sit in a room with environmental scientists talking about how a Christian robust metaphysics and theology of creation is actually a more conducive framework for making sense of sustainability concerns than so much of the flattened assumptions. And I would say, you know, the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si is a great example of somebody trying to find those connections and points of contact. So the architecture question, great question. We need to talk to Christian architects to know where those points are.
That's great. I think we have time for maybe just one more, which sort of general. So I think you can allow you to recapitulate any points you want to hammer home.
Okay.
But as Christian journals, what does it look like for us to approach our mission as offering the truth of Christianity as a gift to our campuses, as opposed to mission of proving its truth? What do you think we have to do to offer? What do you think we have to offer to this endeavor?
Yeah. So what I'm imagining is, and actually, by the way, your journals are doing this. I'm just trying to give you an articulation or rationale in some ways of what you're already doing. But what I'm imagining is we look for those challenges today, those common human questions that the university is grappling with, and we try to look for the ways that the distinctives of the Christian faith help contribute to that. So let me, maybe examples would help. So for example, I think, is it fair to say that we might all be experiencing a certain crisis of democracy in the United States of late? At least we're having a conversation about what does democracy look like? What does it take to make this work? What's going on? I would say a great journal article would be people coming and offering and saying, here is, first of all, here's kind of the theological heritage of democracy that you might not have realized. Here are the virtues that are necessary for people to be democratic citizens. Who is forming communities with those sorts of virtues, and how can we contribute to that? And maybe this is something that Christianity and the church can speak to. It's something like that. I think it's a matter of looking for, let's talk about systemic racism and injustice. What does it look like for us to collectively make progress on that? And I'm just thinking out loud here, but could the strange and almost anathema Christian idea of sin actually contribute to making sense of the intractability and frustrations we keep having with this problem? I'm hoping we can do more work like that then becomes, it will be provocative, but it's actually offered in the spirit of saying, we want to understand with you and think better about this problem, this area, this challenge.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Jamie. I think you have to run at this point, but
yes.
Thank you again for your talk. You're just enormously insightful and beneficial to our students.
Thanks, everybody. Pleasure. Thank you.
The students could just stay on for a second. Just want to do some quick announcements. If you're an AC student, you will now break out into your conference groups again to discuss Jamie's talk and reaching your campus. Conference group leaders, please refer back to the pre-distributed discussion guide for the prompts for this meeting. If you are not able to locate the discussion guide, please reach out to the AC team. And if anyone has trouble getting into their conference groups, please reach out to us as well. The conference group will be the last meeting tonight, and we will be all back tomorrow together. The first event tomorrow is an optional pair session with your conference group. We encourage you to attend, but it is optional if you are not able to attend. The conference group leaders, in the discussion guide, there is a suggested format for you to use for this prayer session, but feel free to lead in a different way if you prefer. If anyone, conference group or otherwise, has any questions about the prayer session, let the AC team know. After that optional session, we will be back tomorrow at 11 a.m. promptly Eastern Time, all together for the Welcome to the Day session hosted by our new ACE program manager, Mariah Speciale, who we are really excited to have on board for this work and excited for her to address you all tomorrow. She will share about some of the logistics of the day and also be announcing another AC award. So you definitely don't want to miss that session. The link for that session should be in Cvent, but if you have any other questions about how to access that session, please reach out to the AC team. We look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern promptly after your optional conference group prayer. But for now, please sign off the Zoom call, go to your next session title in Cvent called Conference Group in the Cvent Event Hub. Click into that session to find the join button and join your conference group for your second discussion session. Thanks so much and see you tomorrow.